Table maintenance. I've archived off some old data from one of my tables. Should I reorg the data? At what point do I think, yep, I should actually do something in terms of reparative maintenance to this table or a reorg? How do I know? My general rule of thumb, and when I say rule of thumb, this is my first position, and that is it's probably not worth it. And that's what I generally do. I think unless I can prove to myself there is a benefit to be gained, then why bother? I may as well just do nothing and keep an eye on things. If performance degrades or there are other opportunities, then fine. But I don't go, oh, because I've done data maintenance, I must do a reorg, which a lot of people tend to do. I've done data maintenance. I need to prove to myself I should do a reorg before I actually go ahead and do it. And the question is, how do we do that? Let's do a demo. So I'm going to create a nice big table here. This is 20 copies of DBA objects, about 1.5 million rows, I think. If we go look at the data, 1.5 million rows, it's got 32,000 blocks, give or take. That's the size of the table. Without actually knowing the genuine number of blocks, I could probably make an estimate on the number of blocks using the other information. If I know how many rows are in the table, 1.6 million, I know the average length of a row, I could actually say, well, that times that is the number of bytes, divided by 8192 is the number of blocks. Now, every block has % free in it, so I can do that effectively times it by 90% to add that padding. And that gives me an estimate as to what I think the blocks probably would have been. It came out at about 29,800. So you can see my estimate's a bit low. My estimate came out, the real value is 32,200. My estimate was 29,000. Now that I know those two figures, I can make an adjustment. I can say if I do 32,000 divided by 29,000, it gets me about 1.08. So it's a reasonable assumption to say there's about 8% overhead in every block. If I factor that in to my estimate, I can now get a reasonably accurate estimate of how many blocks a table should consume given the number of rows and the average size of that row. So I'm pretty close there, 32,000 and change. Let's now do some data maintenance. I deleted 1/3 of all the rows. So I did a delete where mod row num, 3. So effectively 1/3 of all the rows are gone. I deleted 500,000 rows. Let's regather stats. Now I can look at my calculation of estimated blocks versus the number of blocks in the table. Now I've done no reorg of the table, so the number of blocks is unchanged. It's 32,250 something. But my estimate now is I think the table should consume about 21,500 blocks. So using simple database stats, the number of rows, the average row length, and a little bit of padding, you can get an estimate of how big a table probably should be, and then compare it to how big it actually is on disk at the moment. That's a nice little thing. It's like, well, okay, if I did do a reorg, I'm probably going to get about 11,000 blocks back. And so that's your first thing, is quantitatively find out what is the potential savings you're going to get. Now, if we do an alter table move, let's see how close my estimate was. Alter table move to regain that space, regather some stats, and I came out at 21,538 as compared to 21,444. So my estimate was pretty good, and I actually got 11,000 blocks back. Getting space back isn't necessarily, though, the proof you need, because who cares, 11,000 blocks? Maybe that's worth it because maybe it's going to make your backups smaller. Maybe, it's generally just getting space back. I don't think often fully justifies doing a reorg. If your table is going to have more activity, let's see what happens. Create my table again from scratch, 20 copies of DBA objects. As we saw, it's 32,000 blocks. I delete 500,000 rows, basically 1/3 of all the rows. But if my table is expecting more activity, if I delete 500,000 of the oldest rows, but over the next 3 weeks, I'm going to be inserting, not obviously in one hit as an example here, but over the next few weeks, I'm expecting another 500 million rows to come in. Well, the table is 32,000 blocks, as we saw there. If I regather stats, the table is still 32,000 blocks. Deleting 1/3 of the table, inserting brand new rows, that space got reused. It would have been a waste of time to reorg that table down to 21,000 blocks because it's just going to go up to 32,000 anyway. And we see here that even though we didn't do a reorg, the table didn't grow without bound. It actually reused that free space. Justify that you're going to get some space, but then justify if it's actually worth it, because if you're going to have new activity, new insertions, you're probably wasting your time doing a reorg. That space is just going to grow anyway. The second thing is it worth it based on the type of access you do? I'm going to drop my table. Here it is again, 20 copies of DBA objects. But this time I'm going to put an index on one of the columns as well. Let's wipe out my 1/3 of the table. There's my data maintenance. It's working a bit harder now. Commit that away. Let's look at some kind of queries that you might run on this table. The first one here is just a max created. That's not an index column. That's a full table scan. That cost me about 33,000 consistent gets. There's this one, which is a large index range scan. So even though I'm using an index, I'm actually querying 700,000 rows here. So you can see that's 26,000 consistent gets. And here is a much smaller range scan because the system value of system is much smaller number of rows, only 6,000 rows, and it's only 487 consistent gets. So I've got a full table scan, about 34,000, large range scan, 26,000, small range scan, 500. That's after I did my big data maintenance operation. Let's now reorg the table. Let's see if it actually was worthwhile doing a reorg of the table. And an alter table move, rebuild the index. So remember those 34,000, 26,500. The full table scan does benefit. It goes from 34,000 down to 21,000. If your application does a lot of full table scans, then maybe a reorg after data maintenance is a good thing. It's going to be worth your while. Once again, caveat there is if the table is going to grow again, maybe you have to balance that off. Large range scan went from 25,000 down to 17,000. Once again, if you're doing large index range scans, there's probably some benefit to actually doing a reorg. Small index range scans, primary key lookups, etc. 450 down to 425, really no difference. Here's the key thing is a reorg is fine as long as you can justify the space savings, but also justify the ongoing benefit to your application in the way your application uses the data. If it's all full table scans, reorgs are probably going to be a good thing. If you're always going to be replaced in the data you just deleted, reorg's probably just a waste of time. But at least now you can have some quantitative analysis to actually prove, are my reorgs actually getting me a business benefit? And if you can't answer that question with a yes, then don't bother doing them. It's just burning resources that you don't need to burn. I have a couple of rules of thumb when it comes to doing reorgs. If it's what I call your final resting place, and often, like for example, I'll have maybe 10 years worth of data. I'm maybe grabbing the last 8 years and putting it somewhere, and that's going to be query only. If something is its final resting place, it's not going to be touched again. I'm going to reorg the daylights out of it once. I'm going to compress it. I'm going to reshuffle the data so it's really good clustering, come up with the best indexing strategy, maybe put some of it in memory, and I'm done. And I'll never touch it again. So data that's about to go into its final resting place, perfect for actually doing a heavy duty reorg stuff. The other one, which is interesting, is sometimes what I call the initial resting place. What I mean by that is if I'm loading data into a data warehouse, sometimes I'll load that data into its own table in isolation. Therefore, once again, I can compress it, index it, whatever, and then either ship it into my warehouse or exchange partition into my warehouse, etc. Knowing that I'm not going to be doing anything with it, it's once again just going to be read only. Final resting place, initial resting place, generally things between those two things where the table will still be actively in use, I'm going to have to make sure I can prove it to myself that I'm going to get some benefit. And I should say that it's not just space reclaim that is the thing that you might justify doing reorgs. Now that we can do so many things online in Oracle 12, one of the things that we can do is, for example, is do attribute clustering and compression, such that sometimes, even though we have a table which is growing over time, we'll take that time occasionally to reshuffle the data to make our indexes really, really fantastic. And knowing that they will then degrade again, but we might get a lot of application benefit just for that point in time.